The Battlefield series has taken us through several theaters of war, from World War II to Vietnam to modern combat to the war on crime. You'd think the next logical step would be just launch them into space to fight aliens. Instead, developer DICE defied our expectations in the best possible way and sent the franchise back in time 100 years to one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history that would eventually shape warfare into what we play today from the safety of our collective couches, World War I. Just how is it that DICE decided that the future of first-person shooters was in the past? What's up, guys? I'm the Jovenshire with the leaderboard, and today we're going to be counting down 107 facts you should know about Battlefield 1. Fasten your gas masks, people, because we're going to war. Battlefield 1 is the latest game in the long-running first-person shooter series Battlefield, which started with the critically acclaimed Battlefield 1942 released back in 2002. This installment is yet again developed by series creator DICE. Unlike most modern shooters, Battlefield 1 takes a step back from the modern battlefields of Call of Duty and the galactic war zones of Halo for a setting not often explored in video games, World War I. DICE decided upon the confusing Battlefield 1 title because they believed World War I was the beginning of all-out warfare. Well, it's a better excuse than the Xboxes. I know what a lot of you are thinking. They definitely made Battlefield 1 to one-up Call of Duty for not going back to World War II. The reasoning behind the choice wasn't a political conspiracy, actually. DICE wanted to create a Battlefield game set in World War I 10 years before it was ultimately released. EA's chief of development, Patrick Sutherland, rejected the pitch for a Battlefield set in World War I multiple times, his reason being that there was no way DICE could make a game about World War I enjoyable. He saw the concept of trench warfare to be boring from a gameplay perspective. After producing a short demo showcasing their vision of World War I, Sutherland realized he had made a huge mistake and greenlit the project immediately. See guys, EA isn't evil. Sometimes. One of the reasons DICE chose World War I as the backdrop was because of how diverse the combat actually was, making for a variety of playstyles that would ultimately appeal to a wide range of players. Whether you're dogfighting in airplanes, blowing your enemies to Kingdom Come in a tank, majestically taking out fools on horseback, or beating them to death with a shovel in the muddy trenches, World War I offers a degree of diversity not found in wargaming today. The setting was also decided from the desire to create a completely different Battlefield game that challenged its fanbase. They actually studied several eras of warfare in human history, like the wars fought by the Roman Empire before settling on the ever so complicated World War I. At one point in time, DICE considered taking the franchise to space by making their next Battlefield game a sci-fi shooter. After what happened with Call of Duty, I think it's safe to say DICE made the right decision here. Battlefield 1 is not EA's first foray into World War I. That honor goes to Wings of Glory, which was released in 1994. Unlike its descendant, this game was not a first-person shooter. Rather, it focused specifically on biplane combat. When developing and attempting to differentiate the various Battlefield games, DICE would refer to Battlefield 4 as an experience akin to Formula 1 car racing, while Battlefield 1 was more along the lines of rally racing. Both are highly competitive, but in different ways. One challenge when creating this game was that World War I wasn't a prominent subject within the mainstream pop culture and media, which meant that finding the proper source materials for research was quite the test. However, the developers' discoveries allowed for experiences that felt new and fresh for the uninformed masses. They should use Battlefield 1 to teach high school history classes. Given how rarely the Great War has been portrayed in games, Alexander Grondel and his team did loads of research on the subject to provide the game with much authenticity. One of the biggest sources of inspiration came from the 4-hour-long French documentary Apocalypse: World War I, which chronicles the war through a variety of first-person accounts. The game's choice of color palette was inspired by the 2004 book World War I in Color by Charles Messenger. The book features real photographs from the battlefields of the First World War, but touched up with color. It actually surprised the developers how important color was in immersing the viewers into a conflict such as the First World War. One of the biggest sources that aided in their research was not visual, but auditory. Alec Grundle is a huge fan of the podcast Carlin's Hardcore History, more specifically the World War I series, Blueprints for Armageddon. Grundle asserted that the war seemed more like a horror game rather than that of a shooter. Lars Gustafsson said that he never realized how many empires fell during the course of the war until he was doing research for the game. He then understood their collapse opened up a new era for the free world. The development team went as far as sending our drones to fly over and record the real location where some of the bloodiest battles of World War I took place. This was done in order to recreate environments with as much accuracy as they could imagine. While Battlefield 1 is still true to the series at being a first-person shooter, DICE sought to spice up the gameplay by diversifying attacks within the game. Some of these include beating your enemy's head in with a shovel or club, shish kebabbing them with a bayonet, cooking them up medium rare with flamethrowers. Yeah, you get the picture. Unlike previous games, Battlefield 1's masks are a piece of equipment players can take on and off. And thanks to threats like mustard gas, they actually serve a purpose in protecting the player from taking damage. However, there is a drawback to wearing the mask. Not only will it obscure your vision, but the mask will also prevent weapon accuracy. Battlefield 1 does away with the in-depth weapon customization and loadout freedoms found in so many iterations of this franchise. Each class has exclusive access to certain weapons. Assault has SMGs and shotguns, medics have DMRs, scouts have bolt-action rifles, and support has LMGs. The difference is that the guns are presets with different attachments. This was done not only to bring balance to the game, but to ensure that each individual weapon feels unique and caters to numerous playstyles. Melee combat has gotten more complex in Battlefield 1, with the players being able to use a variety of weapons that span 3 different classes: knives, clubs, and specials. They differ in 3 ways: speed, damage, and fatal simplicity. There are a lot of ways to die. A few of the game's melee weapons can be used for much more than brutally ending lives. For instance, if you need to pass some barbed wire, slice it open with a knife. Does that enemy have a cheaply made wooden barricade outside their trench? Bash it open with a club. Has the enemy foolishly parked their vehicle outside your base completely unattended? I think you know what to do with that hammer. The cover art was designed in such a way that it would invoke a sense of shock and curiosity on behalf of the consumer. Not only was World War I not limited to trenches, but it was also not confined to one race of people. The participants of this war were all very diverse. In Battlefield 1, the developers attempted to marry multiplayer with a sense of narrative ordinarily found in a campaign. The main effort being the fact that the multiplayer maps are based on real conflicts that had occurred during the actual war. They also tried this with Operations Mode, a game type in which players cross a series of interconnected maps where each decision has an impact on the ultimate outcome. When development on this game began, the team was guilted into incorporating horses into the gameplay, as they were quite heavily utilized in the actual conflict. DICE had quite a hard time implementing the noble steed in a meaningful and fun way, and thought the horses would be universally dismissed by the player as a useless mechanic. To their surprise, the horses became one of the most popular aspects of the multiplayer beta. Seeing as how tanks made their debut in World War I, the team had a hard time making the tanks formidable and powerful while not sending foot soldiers into a permanent state of respawning. They even had to add certain tools that may or may not have gone against the grains of history to make the gameplay more practical. The biggest challenge in creating the game was taking the Battlefield formula back in time by 100 years to create a new experience while simultaneously staying true to Battlefield's core gameplay. One goal that the team hoped to accomplish with Battlefield 1 was giving the character classes more defined and unique roles that they previously had in the past, meaning more weapons and abilities were strictly exclusive to prevent an overlap in playstyles. The tanker class ability to customize tanks was inspired by the experimentations different militaries conducted on their own tanks during World War I. Each faction that possessed that armored behemoth designed them in a variety of different ways, from their gun types to their armor. Each one was a valiant attempt at a perfect death machine. While the game's War Stories features a female soldier, the multiplayer does not feature the option to let the ladies to bloody their hands. This wasn't always the case. According to an ex-DICE coder, the multiplayer mode was to feature the ability to play as a woman on the front lines, but was scrapped over the concern that young boys wouldn't take the game seriously or think it believable. Okay, DICE, tell that to Call of Duty, Left 4 Dead, Mass Effect, Unreal Tournament, Gears of War, Halo 5, and the list goes on and on and on. According to Grundle, while the Great War was known for the unspeakable horrors faced by millions of men, he didn't want to focus on that aspect of the war too much, as it would dampen players' moods. As a result, they used the horrific nature sparingly. In true Battlefield fashion, they chose to focus on themes of adventure, youth, and hopefulness when telling the stories and molding the overall gameplay. While DICE strove to create something historically accurate, they decided to alter history slightly if it didn't serve gameplay well. For example, the game features the gas-powered Sairogati rifle, a weapon that wasn't officially used in the war, but was simply too fun to pass up. Battlefield 1 features dynamic weather changes on its multiplayer maps, and it does much more than just look nice. Adding fog or rain to the battle can change the fight in many different ways, like limit the vision of all players, either prompting them to move more cautiously or sneak with ease into the enemy base. The dynamic weather system adds a bit of variety to the same lineup of maps, making them more replayable than the average shooter map. Alex Grundle states that because rifles were more experimental and less defined than they are now, it allowed for more assorted arsenal with specific functions as opposed to assault rifles in a modern shooter. Back in World War I, much of the technology being used, like tanks, were pretty much prototypes, meaning that 1 in every 3 shells would explode. For example, tanks and other equipment would frequently malfunction or fall apart. DICE actually implemented this malfunctions early into the build of the game, but came to the conclusion that the random nature of such authenticity would make for much frustration amongst the players. Some of the sounds recorded for the guns in the game were actually made by weapons used in World War I. According to Alex Grundle, it was a hell of a worldwide hunt trying to track down these weapons, as they obviously are not so common anymore. Luckily, he found some models in the United States and Sweden. For weapons that they couldn't find, they used the sounds of prototype weapons used in World War II, which, according to their weapons consultants, didn't change much sound-wise. Because the sounds of World War I aren't exactly the most well documented, the sound engineers went and personally recreated just about every sound heard in the game, from guns firing to boots traversing the mud. The sound designers recreated full outfits using materials like leather in order to get the sounds that the soldiers' uniforms made. In fact, the engineers had a rule that required everyone on the team not to wear anything containing modern materials like Velcro or nylon during recording sessions in order to keep 2016 out of 1916. If you thought the sound design team would call it quits when it came to some of the bigger fish like tanks and airplanes, you clearly underestimate their ambition. They were able to track down real planes and tanks and operate them to get the sounds they needed. According to Twitch streamer Christopher Prophet Strickland, who was also made part of the official Battlefield Twitch stream to promote the game, Battlefield 1's lack of modern-day lock-on and shoot weaponry left players feeling a bit frustrated. This was due to the less advanced arsenal at the player's disposal, making skill a huge component to being successful in the game. Prophet states that taking out a tank can either be incredibly difficult or relatively simple. While the tanks take more time to destroy in Battlefield 1, skilled players will be able to exploit a series of weak points that will gradually lead to the vehicle's demise. If you're attacking these weak points by your lonesome or with a bunch of randoms, things will become more difficult, and a skilled tanker will be able to take you out and consistently keep their tank in good condition. DICE enlisted a small group of YouTubers when developing the game for their own YouTube channel, The Great War, which boasts over 500,000 subscribers. The channel covers every square inch of World War I from the beginning to end in impressive detail. DICE hired hosts Indy Nidell and Marcus Link to write every entry for the game's codec. DICE also tasked the channel with coming up with names for the 70+ medals you can earn in the game. Since they couldn't use real military medals due to pesky copyright laws, DICE asked that every medal be agnostic so that any faction could win them. Halo's theater mode might want to watch its back. Battlefield 1 implemented an enhanced spectator mode not only to show the world how many noobs you can no-scope, but to provide in-game cinematic productions or machinima. Not only are you able to move the camera around, you can change filters, field of view, and the depth of field to create your own Spielberg-style war films. The gritty and intense musical score of Battlefield 1 was the joint collaboration of composers Johan Sudikvist and Patrick Andrén. You may also have heard Sudikvist's work if you've seen the 2008 horror film Let the Right One In. Andrén is perhaps better known for his work on the TV series The Bridge. When writing the score, the composers wanted to keep with DICE's vision of a sense of full immersion. They strove to create something that successfully conveyed the dark and traumatizing times of the war. Though the war only lasted 4 years, the technology and weapons were changing quickly and dramatically. That being said, DICE found that, even though they wanted to stick to realism, they prioritized fun and included all weapons, even later ones, available to use from the very beginning. It wouldn't be a Battlefield game without huge war zones with a ridiculous amount of players shooting each other up. The game supports massive 64-player firefights on a wide selection of maps that span from the Alps all the way to the desert. Due to the time period, the long-lasting engineer class present in every Battlefield game since Battlefield 1942 has been cut from the game. Well, not entirely. It has instead been split into two subclasses, tankers and pilots. The engineer trait comes in the form of the ability to repair vehicles, which can be done from within, though Reapers will immobilize the vehicle until repairs have stopped. On top of that, being a tanker or pilot is practically suicide if you hop out of your vehicle with just a junky carbine and a hammer. According to DICE senior producer Alexander Grundle, going back to World War I was a very liberating experience for the studio. He claimed that modern warfare as a genre became a trope in and out of itself and was constantly catering to audiences' expectations. He also believed that modern technology doesn't make for a very immersive experience, stating that it feels like the player assumes the role of a HUD, heads-up display, rather than a living, breathing soldier. By traversing into World War I, Grundle believes the lack of modern, overpowered tech returns immersion back to the player. DICE made a point to make teamwork a much more crucial component in the game than in any other Battlefield that came before, because if you fight alone without a squad or can't communicate with your teammates on the most basic level, you're gonna have a difficult time. It was important to make players feel like they were essential to a team and that teamwork would be essential for victory. Unlike previous games in the series, Battlefield 1 doesn't have a singular campaign per se, but an anthology of 6 different war stories from the perspective of soldiers from the different countries, from Italy to Australia. One of the goals the developers hoped to accomplish with this campaign mode was to marry the systematic gameplay with multiple tactics found in Battlefield's multiplayer. Some examples of this included giving the player the choice to either destroy the enemy's artillery guns or retrieve their weapons for personal gain. A huge part of why developers based the campaign chapters in different corners of the conflict was because most of the general public wasn't familiar with the events that occurred on the Western Front. DICE wanted to make real heroes from the conflict that were shadowed by history known by players everywhere. Since World War I was such a massive conflict, the goal of the campaign wasn't the typical stop the bad guy and win the war as seen in most shooters. To better immerse the players in the war and help them understand what it was like, they decided to instead focus on personal stories of a single soldier trying to survive a small battle and achieve a tiny victory on the behalf of their faction. Part of the goal of the narrative team in Battlefield 1's campaign was to educate the masses on the various different tactics that were actually used by factions in the Great War aside from trench warfare. One of their favorite tactics was found in the conflict between Austria-Hungary and Italy, in which the two countries set off avalanches to kill more soldiers than their bullets did. DICE decided to blur the lines between the typical good guy, bad guy archetypes found in most war games. There are points in the campaign where you can sneak up on your enemies undetected and you may see them doing everyday tasks like peeling potatoes. This was done to blur the lines between good and evil and show the player that everybody in a war, even your enemies, are human beings just like you are. The lead scribe behind the emotionally heavy personal stories of Battlefield 1 was British writer Stephen Hall. Hall is perhaps best known for writing the best-selling and award-winning 2007 novel, The Raw Shark Texts. Hall has also written for other video games like Crysis 3 and Rise: Son of Rome. While writing several stories for a game may seem harder than just writing one, Steve Hall begs to differ. It allowed the writing team to not just focus on one viewpoint in a conflict that had so many other stories to tell, it also allowed the stories behind those viewpoints to be shaped in a variety of ways, giving writers the freedom to control the structure and not the other way around. If the cutscenes in Battlefield 1 felt more like a movie and less like a video game, it's because they were directed by two live-action filmmakers, Marcus Kryler and Fredrik Åkerström. Prior to Battlefield 1, the duo directed a short film called Reset. Thanks to their success in Battlefield, the duo is now looking to direct a female-led action movie called Hummingbird. According to the design director Lars Gustafsson, the game's emotional prologue was designed in such a graphic way to show players just how brutal this overlooked war was and how combat on the front lines was practically a hopeless and suicidal effort featuring not good guys and bad guys, but real people fighting for their lives. The game's female protagonist, Zara Gufran, was probably based off of the alleged love of T.E. Lawrence, a Lebanese woman by the name of Fadra al-Aql. It is said that she is the one that taught Lawrence Arabic. While Black Bess wouldn't have survived the massive artillery strike in Through Mud and Blood, there is still a shred of truth to this story. Believe it or not, there was actually a British tank in the war that became separated from the rest of the British military during the Battle of Amiens. It traveled deep into enemy territory, taking out several German encampments, troops, and weapons over the course of a whopping 9 hours before it was actually stopped. Some of the crew were killed outright while the rest were taken prisoner. Australian protagonist Jack Foster bears a striking resemblance to Private James Charles Martin of the 1st Australian Imperial Force in World War I. Martin died of typhoid during the Gallipoli campaign when he was just 14 years old, making him the youngest Australian soldier to die in the war. The chapter name Avanti Savoia roughly translates into Onward Savoy, which was an Italian war cry soldiers would yell before charging into the blaze of battle. Savoy was the name of a royal Italian family that lasted up until 1946. While it may seem a bit ridiculous, the Adarti troops seen in Avanti Savoia actually did have some body armor similar to what appears in the game. The real Adarti armor, often referred to as lobster armor, was rarely used and mainly functioned as a scare tactic made of cheap sheet metal that was hard to maneuver in and left the user quite vulnerable. That, plus the weight of a machine gun, definitely made it hard to move around. Clyde Blackburn isn't the only Blackburn to appear in the Battlefield series. The main character of Battlefield 3 is Staff Sergeant Henry Blackburn, whose grandfather fought in World War II. If his family's military history goes back a bit further, Clyde could be Henry's great-grandfather. The game does feature some real historical figures, like T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. No, he wasn't just a movie character. Lawrence was remembered for his role in both the Sinai and Palestine campaigns, in addition to the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. The character Daniel Edwards, featured in the chapter Through Mud and Blood, is visually based off of the actor that portrays him, Ed Spielers. While you may think the insanely small Colibri handgun found in the game was something made up by DICE for laughs, guess again! The tiny gun exists in real life and was designed by an Austrian watchmaker by the name of Franz Fanil in 1914. The name Colibri is derived from the name colibri, a type of hummingbird, which are known to be some of the smallest birds in the world. Occasionally in the campaign, you will find soldiers lifting helmets above the trench with their rifles, only to find the helmet shot off. This was a real tactic soldiers used during the war to find out if they were in the sights of an enemy gun. In certain multiplayer maps of the game, you are able to play as people of different races, and while people may claim this is a cheap shot to have a diverse cast, they couldn't be more wrong. World War I occurred during a time filled with empires and nations that had conquered other countries and cultures under their own flag. Take the Sinai desert map, which features British troops of different races. During World War I, Britain pulled soldiers from all over their territories to fight for their side in the war, including troops from East Africa, Canadians, Nepalese Gurkhas, and Indians, of which 1.3 million fought for the British Empire. The club found in the game is based on a practice many soldiers in the trenches would take up. In the case of a trench raid, soldiers would have to stay silent, so guns were out of the question. On top of that, there was not much room to navigate, so soldiers would often keep a knife on them for these close-quarter encounters. Or they'd take the nearest hunk of wood, plaster it with nails, and create one hell of a murder weapon. Are you struggling with your skill level? Do you want to become great? EA and DICE have created an online service called Battlefield 1 Bootcamp. Located on the official site, the Battlefield 1 Bootcamp is a free online course consisting of video tutorials created by pros in the Battlefield community spread across 3 skill levels: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. If you link your EA account to this bootcamp, you will be rewarded with a special online Phantom dog tag. Despite the game's diverse set of weapons, most soldiers in World War I would typically carry bolt-action rifles and grenades, the former of which would frequently break. When that happened, they would resort to hand-to-hand combat. Other types of guns featured in the game, like the submachine guns, were a rarity in the war. The only one that was really seen was the MP-18, and even then, there were only about 10,000 of them on the field by the end of the war. Battlefield 1 features the Lewis gun, the MG-15 and Madison MG as light machine guns, and while the game gets these weapons mostly accurate in gameplay, there is a big inconsistency realistically. You can't successfully shoot it from the hip with pinpoint accuracy. While you could carry it or even run with it for a short distance, firing the weapon while holding it is another story entirely. Moving while firing the weapon would be much like holding a weighted object while marching up a hill against a strong wind. Unlike the sniper rifles in Battlefield 1, the sniper rifles used in World War I were not weapons that could easily kill a target in one shot. Furthermore, a majority of these weapons lacked a scope, as it was a difficult and expensive process when it came to manufacturing optics that could withstand the rifle's intense recoil. Regardless, there were guns fielded in the war that featured scopes, like the SMLE, the Lebel Carcano, and the Mannlicher 1895. Perhaps one of the more accurately portrayed guns in the game is the Winchester 1897, aka the trench gun. It was such an effective weapon that the German Empire actually petitioned the United States to ban it, claiming it was in direct violation of the Hague Convention, which prohibits firearms that cause unnecessary suffering. Unlike the game's SMGs, the trench gun was a very common weapon used by the US troops, as they were cheap to manufacture. Unlike the game, the MP-18 Bergmann did not have a bayonet lug, but its post-war successor, the MP-28, did. According to historians, Zeppelins tended to look much more menacing than they actually were in combat. At the start of the war, they were mainly used for recon, but was eventually outfitted for bombing runs. These weaponized Zeppelins were not nearly as powerful as their in-game counterparts and were ultimately incapable of turning the tide of a battle. They mainly relied on striking fear in enemy troops. The man on the cover of the game is a member of the Harlem Hellfighters. The Hellfighters were the first African-American unit to serve within the American Expeditionary Forces. Though many American forces refused to work alongside them, they aided the French military against the Germans in 1918 and became known for their never say die attitude. Their fighting spirit earned the Hellfighters respect amongst German soldiers, who actually gave them the Hellfighters name. Who doesn't crave a bit of nostalgia? When sending coordinates using the device that spew out Morse code, there's a very tiny chance that the original theme from Battlefield 1942 will begin playing. You're probably well past the point of basic addiction to this game, so I'm sure you'll hear it plenty of times. In the opening cutscene for Through Mud and Blood, players with attention to detail may notice a chalkboard with the word faith written on it. While you could assume it's some kind of motivational tool that plays on the soldiers' religious beliefs, it could also be a reference to Faith Connors, the hero of DICE's first-person action series Mirror's Edge. When capturing a point in the game, you'll hear a short message and a string of Morse code over the telegraph. Translating the Morse code will give you, wait for it, Morse. The code is Morse. It's pretty anticlimactic, but I know, it's just funny. During the mission, Friends in High Places, head southwest to the tallest mountain after the mission prompts you to destroy the ground targets with rockets. You will find a tiny wooden stack atop the mountain. If you shoot it, the pile will be set ablaze, resembling the beacons of Gondor from the Lord of the Rings. Battlefield 4 had some pretty wild Easter eggs. For instance, there's the legendary Megalodon shark leaping out of the water. Battlefield 1 features an allusion to the prehistoric beast on the Suez map. You'll see a huge ship parked off the coast, and much like everything in Battlefield, it's destructible. Destroying it will send it ablaze, but it will also trigger the wailing sound of the Megalodon ringing throughout the air. But alas, there's still no shark to be seen. Much like Battlefield 3, there are teddy bears hidden within Battlefield 1 on the map. One can be found in the Ballroom Blitz. Just keep smashing every crate you can find, and eventually a teddy bear will pop out and look deep into your soul. Because it's impossible to keep a secret during the age of the internet, Battlefield 1's existence was leaked prior to its official announcement via a picture of promotional art. That confusing title must have thrown so many people off. When the announcement trailer for the game was released on YouTube, it had accumulated a whopping 31 million views, making it the most viewed trailer for an EA game of all time. Whoa! On top of being the most viewed trailer for any EA game, Battlefield 1's trailer was the most liked game trailer on YouTube, coming in at a whopping 2 million plus likes. Now, 1 week prior, Battlefield Nemesis Call of Duty claimed a much less prestigious award for Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, which accumulated over 1 million plus dislikes, making it the most disliked trailer on YouTube. You've won this round, Battlefield. Battlefield 1 was gaining recognition by the gaming industry well before its release. After its appearance at E3 2016, Battlefield 1 was nominated for 5 categories, including Best in Show and Best Online Multiplayer. In the end, it wound up taking home the award for Best Action Game. Like every other shooter since Halo 3, Battlefield 1 had a multiplayer beta available on PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4 from August 31st, 2016 up until September 8th, 2016. In that short span of time, a whopping 13.2 million players participated in the test, which was over twice the strength of the entire British and Ottoman empires deployed in the Middle East during World War I. The most popular class chosen during the beta was the Assault class, which was chosen 30% of the time, followed closely by the 360 no-scoping Scout class at 28%. The least popular of the main four was the Medic, which only 10% of players chose, meaning not many Battlefield players have watched Hacksaw Ridge. Eventually, players everywhere were able to experience DICE's glorified World War I simulator on October 21st, 2016, when Battlefield 1 was released for PC, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One. Following in the vein of other shooters like Call of Duty and Halo, Battlefield 1 was given a $100 plus collector's edition including a 14-inch statue. It also came with a deck of playing cards, for when you're awaiting an enemy attack in the trenches and a messenger pigeon tube to send messages across enemy lines. And by enemy lines, we mean sneaking notes to each other during study hall. To promote the game, the official Battlefield Twitter account began churning out memes based on World War I near the game's release. Many people took offense to this promotional campaign, claiming it was romanticizing one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history for the sake of profit. EA promptly removed the memes from the face of the internet, until news sources re-uploaded them, because that's what the internet does. On the week of its release, Battlefield 1 became the best-selling game in the UK, selling more copies than Battlefield 4 and Battlefield Hardline combined in the first week. Battlefield 1 conquered both the West and East, with the PS4 version topping the Japanese sales charts on its first week of release with a whopping 113,083 copies. As of January 2017, the PS4 version has sold nearly 250,000 copies in Japan. A DICE employee discovered suspiciously after October 21st, 2016, tons of children started showing up to the library taking out books about World War I, and yet parents across the globe claim that video games turn their kids' brains into mush. DICE released a companion smartphone app for the Battlefield series, cleverly titled Battlefield Companion. With the Battlefield Companion, not only will you be able to rub your KD ratio in your friends' faces, but you'll also be able to customize your loadouts on the go and even create your own personal multiplayer emblem to be used in-game from scratch with endless possibilities. The question is, what will you make? Battlefield 1 was not only a financial success for the franchise, but a critical one as well. The game was well received on Metacritic with an 89 for the PS4 version, an 88 for the PC Master Race version, and an 87 for the Xbox One version. What's more impressive is that the overall user score was pretty high as well. After its release, Battlefield 1 was honored at the Game Awards 2016, where it was nominated for 4 awards, including Best Multiplayer and Best Action Game. Unfortunately, it didn't bring home any of those awards, but who needs a tiny statue to tell us that the game is amazing? A nomination alone is a win in and of itself. If you're a fan of both Battlefield 1 and Titanfall 2, playing the former will grant you an exclusive Red Baron paint job for your trusty Titan in Respawn's sci-fi shooter. If you think being terrible at Battlefield 1 is a horrible experience, take a look at what happens if you're too good at the game. Ever since Battlefield 3, DICE has implemented an anti-cheating system known as Fair Fight, which compares real-time player stats to the average level of skill. Unfortunately, some players out there are so skilled at the game that the system mistakes these gifted individuals for hackers. I guess there is such a thing as being too good. To keep that old-timey vibe, it was announced in February 2017 that Battlefield 1's soundtrack would be released as a vinyl record. This limited edition package also came with an exclusive poster and a download code for additional tracks. In March of 2017, DICE will release the first DLC expansion pack for Battlefield 1 called They Shall Not Pass, which will introduce the French army as a new playable faction. Unfortunately, there is no Gandalf. It will also introduce new weapons, vehicles, and new multiplayer maps, with the main attraction being the Verdun Heights. The Verdun Heights map is actually based on the Battle of Verdun, a conflict fought between the French army and the German Empire, which was one of the longest and bloodiest battles of World War I. Despite their superior numbers, the German Empire was driven back by the French forces, and people say all they do is surrender. Man, read a history book. They Shall Not Pass won't be the last DLC pack to introduce a new faction. Before the first DLC's release, it was revealed that the Russian Empire would be making their way into a future DLC pack as a playable faction. Once again, I'm the Jovenshire, and thanks for watching 107 facts about Battlefield 1. Have you played yet? What part is your favorite? Comment below and let us know. We have new videos dropping every single week, so let us know what games you want us to cover next. And if you like getting more from your games, be sure to subscribe to the leaderboard, where we help you game smarter.